The smell of antiseptic never quite leaves you when you work in an ER. Even standing in my father's living room the morning after his funeral, surrounded by casserole dishes and cousins I hadn't seen in years, I could still feel it clinging to my skin. I had driven 4 hours from Nashville the night before, still wearing my scrubs under my coat because I hadn't had time to change after my shift. My father hadn't waited for a convenient moment to die. He rarely waited for anything. People filled the house, drifting from room to room with paper plates and low voices. The way people do when grief is less about sadness and more about performance. My brother Derek was in the center of it all. Of course. He stood near the fireplace in his pressed blue shirt, doing that thing he always did. Working the room like a real estate closing. Handshakes and shoulder squeezes. Making sure everyone knew he was holding things together. I found a chair in the corner near the window and sat with a cup of coffee that had gone cold 20 minutes ago. Marcus Webb arrived at 2 o'clock. He was my father's attorney. A quiet man in his late 50s who carried himself like someone used to delivering news that rearranged people's lives. He set his briefcase on the dining room table. And without anyone asking, the crowd in the house thinned itself into the dining room. We all knew why he was there. Derek sat at the head of the table. Sandra, our mother, sat beside him. Her hands folded, her expression unreadable. I took the seat across from her. The chair legs scraped against the hardwood floor, and nobody looked at me. Marcus opened the folder without ceremony. He read through the basics first. The savings account split evenly. The truck to Derek. My father's tools to my uncle. And then he turned the page. To my son Derek. I leave the house, the workshop, and the primary savings bond portfolio. Derek leaned back in his chair slightly and nodded once. The way men do when they expected something and received it. Marcus cleared his throat and continued. To my daughter Lily, I leave the Hargrove Farmstead in Claiborne County. The property. The original cabin structure. And all 212 acres surrounding it. The room didn't explode. It went still. Which was somehow worse. Derek turned his head and looked at me. Not with anger. Not yet. With something closer to amusement. He tilted his chin slightly and a small smile spread across his face. Slow and deliberate. He wanted me to see it forming. That old place, he said it loudly enough for everyone to hear. He glanced at my mother. Then back at me. Dad really left Lily the Claiborne property. He laughed once under his breath. I guess it fits. A broke nurse in a falling down farmhouse. That tracks. A few people shifted uncomfortably. My mother looked down at the tablecloth. I kept my face even. Years of overnight shifts in a trauma bay will teach you to do that. When someone is bleeding out in front of you, you don't show fear. You work the problem. Derek wasn't new. He had been taking swings at me since we were children. Always calculating exactly how hard he could hit without anyone stepping in to stop him. Marcus continued reading without acknowledging the interruption. When the meeting ended, Derek caught me near the kitchen doorway. His voice had dropped to something private. Almost gentle. Which was always when he was most dangerous. Come on, Lily. You know you can't do anything with that land. You're in Nashville. You can barely afford your apartment. Let me handle the Claiborne property. I'll get you something for it. Fair market. Maybe more. He smiled. You can buy something nice. Something that suits you better than a crumbling old shack in the middle of nowhere. I looked at him for a moment. I said I'd think about it. I wasn't going to think about it. The drive to Claiborne County took 3 hours the next morning. I left before anyone else was awake. The roads narrowed the further east I drove. The highway giving way to state routes and then county roads lined with cedar and white pine. The GPS lost confidence somewhere past Tazewell, and I switched to the handwritten directions my father had mailed me 2 months earlier. I hadn't understood why he sent them at the time. Now I did. The farmstead sat at the end of a gravel drive that wound through maybe a quarter-mile of hardwood forest before opening into a clearing. The cabin was old. No kitchen. The porch sagged on the left side and the shutters needed paint. But the structure itself was solid. Thick oak timbers. A stone foundation. A metal roof that had weathered decades without failing. The kind of thing built by people who intended it to last. I stepped inside and expected dust and neglect. Instead, the air smelled faintly of cedar and something else I couldn't name immediately. Lemon oil. Maybe. Like someone had polished the floors not long ago. A small fire had been laid in the wood stove but not lit. On the kitchen table sat a mason jar of wildflowers and a folded note. The handwriting wasn't my father's. The note read, Miss Hargrove. My name is Dottie Pruitt. My husband Walt and I live about a mile down the hollow. Your father asked us to look in on the place. Walt will stop by in the morning. There's soup in the refrigerator. Help yourself. We're glad you came. I reread it twice. Then sat down at the kitchen table in my coat. I hadn't eaten since the funeral. I found the soup. I ate it standing over the sink. Looking out the window at the darkening tree line. Whatever I had expected from this place, it hadn't been someone leaving me soup. Walt Pruitt arrived the next morning at 8. Exactly. He drove a green pickup that had seen a lot of years and wasn't bothered by any of them. He was maybe 68. Broad-shouldered. With the kind of stillness that came from a long life spent paying attention. He introduced himself at the door and handed me a thermos of coffee. He didn't ask a lot of questions. He walked the property with me instead, pointing out things I would have missed. The natural spring behind the eastern tree line. The original stone smokehouse still standing intact behind the cabin. The creek that marked the southern boundary of the property. Your father came out here about 6 weeks before he passed, Walt said, stepping over a root at the edge of the clearing. Spent 4 days. Cleaned the place up. Had some people out to look at some things. He was quiet for a moment. Said one of his daughters might be showing up looking like she'd been handed the losing end of something. Said I should remind her that losing ends have a way of turning around. I looked at him. He said that Walt nodded. Also said to tell you to check the cedar chest in the bedroom closet when you were ready. I asked how he'd known my father. Walt said they'd served together briefly. Years ago. Before Walt settled in Claiborne County and built his life here. He said my father had visited the farmstead a handful of times over the years. Always quietly. Always alone. We walked back to the cabin and I poured us both coffee from the thermos. Walt sat in the wooden chair by the window and let the silence settle naturally. He had the easy manner of someone who understood that not every quiet needed filling. I went to the bedroom closet after he left. The cedar chest was heavy and old. The kind with iron hinges that had oxidized to a deep rust brown. I lifted the lid and the smell of cedar rose around me. Sharp and clean. Inside were documents in a wax-sealed envelope. A stack of photographs held together with a rubber band. And a letter in my father's handwriting addressed to Lily alone. I sat on the edge of the bed and opened the letter first. He wrote that the farmstead had belonged to his grandmother, Eleanor Hargrove, who had bought it herself in 1951 at a time when a woman buying land alone in Claiborne County was not a thing people encouraged. Eleanor had studied the land. She'd had it surveyed 3 times over her life because she believed the eastern ridge held something worth knowing about. She was right. But she never had the resources to act on it. She passed the land to my father with strict instructions: don't sell it. Don't divide it. And one day give it to the one who will do something with it. He wrote that he'd watched Derek his whole adult life and knew what Derek would do with anything valuable. Derek would liquidate it. He would see numbers where other people saw land. And he would convert those numbers into commission and walk away. He wrote that he watched me differently. He said I had Eleanor's quality of paying attention to things other people dismissed. Then he told me to look at the survey documents in the envelope. I opened the envelope and spread the papers across the bed. They were technical. Printed with coordinates and geological notation. but the summary page at the front was clear. The eastern ridge of the Hargrove property contained significant deposits of kaolinite clay, high-grade and commercially viable. There were also notations about natural gas seams running beneath the northwestern section of the land. The estimated combined valuation of the mineral rights, prepared by a certified geologist 18 months before my father's death, was listed at the bottom of the page. I read the number 3 times. I set the paper down on the bed and pressed both hands flat against my knees and breathed. Derek thought he had handed me a crumbling shack in a county nobody cared about. My father had handed me a geological asset worth more than Derek's real estate portfolio. My phone buzzed on the nightstand. Derek's name on the screen. I put the phone face down and went back to reading. There was a second document in the envelope. A letter from my father to Marcus Webb, dated 14 months before his death, outlining his instructions in precise legal language. Mineral rights retained with surface rights. Sole ownership to Lily Grace Hargrove. No partition close. Marcus had already filed the documentation. It was locked. I slept better that night than I had in months. Derek called again the next morning. I was on the porch with coffee when his name came up, and this time I answered. He got to the point within 2 sentences. He'd spoken with someone at a development firm in Knoxville. They had expressed interest in the Claiborne property for a commercial logging operation. He had already had a preliminary conversation about numbers. He said he was doing me a favor. That rural land in Claiborne County didn't hold value long-term. That I needed to think practically. I said, Derek, that land isn't for sale. The warmth in his voice evaporated. Don't be sentimental about this. Lily, you're a nurse making 50-something thousand a year, and you've got a piece of property you can't maintain. I'm trying to help you. You had a development company on the phone before I'd been here 24 hours. I said, that's not help. That's a land grab. His voice shifted. Fine. You want to be stubborn. Go ahead. But that property is a liability, not an asset. You'll figure that out on your own. I hung up. Walt stopped by that afternoon and found me sitting at the kitchen table with the survey documents spread out in front of me. He looked at them without touching anything. The way careful people look at things that belong to someone else. You found it, he said. I told him what I'd found. He nodded slowly, like a man who had suspected as much. Eleanor figured that out in the 60s. He said, couldn't get anyone to take her seriously. Woman alone on rural land back then. Geologists didn't exactly line up to listen. Your dad held on to her surveys all these years. Had them professionally updated before he passed. I asked Walt directly if Derek finds out what's actually under this land. How bad does this get? He looked at me with the patience of someone who had watched a lot of situations unfold. He said, your brother has been in real estate for 12 years. He knows how to apply pressure. He'll come at you legally, publicly, and through your mother if he can manage it. He'll say your father wasn't in his right mind, that you manipulated the will, that the estate should be revisited. Walt paused. He'll make noise until you either fold or outlast him. I asked what he thought I should do. Walt said, call Marcus Webb today. Lock every document down. Then don't discuss this with anyone in your family until you have walls around it. I called Marcus that afternoon. He answered like he'd been waiting for my call, which I suspected he had. He confirmed what I'd already read. The mineral rights were filed under my name alone. The deed was clean. My father had spent the better part of 2 years ensuring that no part of the Claiborne property could be legally challenged. Marcus said he had a full response prepared for any contest Derek chose to file. He told me to expect one. He was right within the week. Derek's attorney sent a formal letter to Marcus, alleging that my father's later documents had been prepared while his cognitive function was diminished, and that the unequal distribution of property assets constituted grounds for an estate review. The letter was dense and official, and I imagined Derek had paid a lot of money for it. Marcus called me the same afternoon. The letter arrived. He said, "This is what we expected. There's no case here. Your father was examined by his physician 4 times in the 14 months before he died. All documentation confirms full cognitive capacity. This will go nowhere in court. What it will do is make noise." It made noise. My mother called me 3 evenings in a row. The first call, she said Derek was hurt. The second call, she said she was worried I was making a mistake I'd regret. The third call, she said, "Lily, he's your brother. Your father's gone. All we have is each other." I told her I heard her. I told her I wasn't selling the land. After the third call, I sat on the porch in the cold and looked at the tree line until the stars came out. It wasn't the legal pressure that wore at me. Legal pressure was a problem with defined edges, and I had a good attorney handling it. What wore at me was the particular exhaustion of being told by your own family that your instincts were wrong. That the thing you were holding was too heavy for you. That you should hand it to someone more capable. Derek had been saying some version of that my entire life. What surprised me was how much it still worked on me. Even now. Even knowing what I knew about what the land was worth. Walt came by the next morning with his wife Dottie, who arrived carrying a plate of biscuits and the immediate impression of someone who had decided to like you before she walked through your door. She was warm and direct, and she looked at the document spread across my kitchen table and said, "Good. You're taking this seriously." Over the next several weeks, the 3 of us worked on the cabin. Walt replaced the sagging porch supports, and I repainted the front door. A deep slate blue. While Dottie cleaned windows and stacked fresh firewood by the door. It was physical work, and it steadied me in the same way. 12-hour ER shifts had always steadied me. When your hands are busy, and the problem in front of you has clear steps, the noise in your head quiets down. One evening, while Walt and I were replacing a rotten board on the back steps, he asked what I was thinking about doing with the land long term. I had been thinking about it for days, but hadn't said it aloud yet. I told him about the women I'd worked with in the ER. The ones who came in for injuries that weren't accidents and had nowhere to go after discharge. The ones who sat in the waiting room with children who needed shoes and forms they didn't know how to fill out. Claiborne County had no women's shelter within 40 miles. There was no transitional housing program for women leaving bad situations. There was a gap the size of a canyon, and I'd been looking at it my whole career. I said I wanted to build something here. Not just keep the land. Build a facility. Transitional housing. Job skills. Childcare. Connections to legal resources. Walt set down his hammer and looked out at the clearing. After a moment, he said, "Eleanor would have liked you." He told me then about a veterans support group he'd been quietly running out of his barn for 6 years. Men and women from the county who had no other local resource. He said they did what they could, but the need was always larger than what he had to offer. I said, "What if we did this together?" He looked at me the way he had on the first morning, steady and unhurried. Then he said, "I was hoping you'd get there on your own." Derek escalated 2 weeks later. A reporter from a regional news outlet in Knoxville published a short piece online. The headline read, "Siblings dispute rural Hargrove estate in Claiborne County." The article was vague, but the implication was clean. A wealthy, development-minded brother was being blocked from rightful access to family land by a stubborn younger sister. I found out about it when 3 people texted me the link within the same hour. I read the article twice. I recognized Derek's framing in every sentence. The language about fairness, about the estate being a family legacy, about unequal treatment. He had fed this to someone and they had printed it without calling me. I called Marcus. He said to say nothing publicly. He said Derek was manufacturing a narrative because he couldn't win legally, and he knew it. I said nothing publicly. What I did instead was call every women's advocacy organization in East Tennessee and introduce myself. I called 2 nonprofit attorneys who specialized in land trusts. I called the county commissioner's office in Claiborne County and asked about zoning considerations for a transitional housing facility. I wrote a detailed funding proposal at the kitchen table by lamplight and sent it to 3 foundations that supported women's services in rural Appalachia. I was building while Derek was yelling. It felt like the right allocation of energy. My mother drove up on a Thursday afternoon, 3 weeks after the article ran. She didn't call ahead. I saw her sedan coming up the gravel drive, and I stood on the porch and waited. She stepped out looking smaller than I remembered, though I knew she hadn't changed. She looked around the clearing slowly, taking in the repaired porch and the painted door and the general evidence that someone had been caring for the place. "It looks better," she said. I said, "Come inside." We sat at the kitchen table with coffee. She kept her hands wrapped around the mug and didn't speak for a long moment. I let the quiet settle the way Walt had taught me without trying to fill it. Finally, she said, "Derek told me the land was worthless. Falling apart. He said you were being sentimental and that it was going to cost you money you didn't have." I said, "Derek knew exactly what the land was worth before the will was read." She looked up at me. I showed her the geological survey. I showed her the valuation document. I showed her the mineral rights filing and the letter from my father that explained in his own words why he had made the choices he made. She read for a long time without speaking. When she finished, she set the papers down carefully and looked out the window. Her expression was something I didn't have a clean name for. A mixture of understanding and something older. Something like grief but pointed inward. "He didn't tell me," she said quietly. "He didn't tell me any of this. He told you what he thought you'd pass on to Derek." I said, "Not unkindly." Her jaw tightened. She started to say something and stopped. Then she said, "I sat silent at that table when Derek said those things about you. I didn't say a word." "I know. I should have." Her voice was thin. "You were always the one who actually showed up. Lily. When your father was sick, during the hospital stays, you drove 4 hours each time without being asked. And I sat at that table and let Derek talk to you like you were nothing." I let her finish. She said, "I don't know how to undo that." I said, "You don't undo it. You just do something different now." She was quiet again. Then she asked about the cabin. What I was planning. What I intended to do with the land. I told her about the foundation. I told her about the women in the ER. About the gap in services. About Walt's veterans group and the possibility of combining efforts on a single facility. I told her about the funding proposals I had sent. She listened the way she hadn't listened in a long time. When I finished, she said, "Your father saw this in you. He always said you were the one who paid attention to what actually mattered." I didn't trust myself to respond to that immediately. I stood up and refilled both coffees, and we sat together until the afternoon light changed. Derek came 3 days later. He drove up fast. The way people do when they've been rehearsing their anger, the entire drive. He got out of the car without closing the door and came across the clearing with that particular stride he had when he'd decided something was already settled. He found me and Walt on the porch. Walt had been helping me measure for a new section of railing, and he didn't move from where he was sitting when Derek walked up. Derek looked at Walt once. Dismissed him, in the way Derek dismissed people who didn't have an obvious use to him. And turned to me. "We need to talk. Alone," I said. "Whatever you have to say, you can say here." He stared at me for a moment. Recalibrating. Then he said, "I've spoken with 3 separate attorneys. Lily, the estate can be contested on multiple grounds. Dad's competency. The timing of the filings. The conflict of interest with Marcus Webb, who was supposedly both his friend and his attorney. You are sitting on a legal fight that will drain everything you have, and I will still be standing at the end of it. Marcus has already filed responses to every argument your attorney raised." I said, "You know that because your attorney told you. There's no case." Derek's expression hardened. His voice dropped. "You think this is about winning in court. I will make this so costly and so exhausting that you walk away just to make it stop. I've done it before. You know I have. I held his gaze. I do know that. I've watched you do it to other people my whole life. But I'm not other people. Derek. And this land was left to me by our father because he knew exactly what you'd do with it. His face went red at the edges. Don't pretend you're better than me. You're a nurse making an hourly wage who lucked into a piece of property she has no idea what to do with. I've already submitted a funding proposal to 3 foundations. I said, the mineral rights are generating interest from 2 separate industrial partners. Marcus is finalizing a land trust structure this week that will make any future legal challenge essentially pointless. And I have the support of your mother. Not your mother. Our mother. Which you assumed you had locked up. The red drained from his face. I said, you told me this place fit me perfectly. You meant it as an insult. You were actually right. It does fit me, but not the way you thought. Walt stood up from the bench and walked down the porch steps without saying a word. He went to his truck, pulled out a thermos, poured 2 cups of coffee, and set them both on the porch railing. Then he went back to measuring. Derek stood at the foot of the steps for a long moment. Whatever he had come prepared to say seemed to have run out. He looked at the cabin, at the cleared path, at the new porch boards, at the place that was visibly alive with someone's intention and care. He said, you're making a mistake. I said, I'll let you know how it goes. He left. He didn't close his car door before he turned around in the drive. And gravel scattered wide as he pulled out. Walt handed me one of the cups from the railing. I took it and sat down on the steps and let out a long breath. That's been sitting in him for 30 years. Walt said. I said. I know. He nodded. People like that need to be the biggest thing in every room. When you stop shrinking to give them space, they don't know what to do with themselves. I drank the coffee and looked out at the tree line. The eastern ridge was visible through the gap in the hardwoods. The ridge that Eleanor had studied with her own instruments 60 years ago. The ridge that had been waiting under every dismissal and insult and moment of silence for someone to finally say yes. I see it. I'll take it. Over the following months, the work was constant and specific and good. Marcus finalized the land trust. 2 industrial partners signed a preliminary agreement regarding the kaolinite clay deposits, structured so that the foundation would receive a percentage of extraction proceeds in perpetuity. Walt's county contacts helped us navigate the zoning applications. A women's advocacy organization in Knoxville came on as a program partner. My mother drove up twice a month without being asked. She cleared brush, carried lumber, painted the inside walls of what would become the facility's first intake room. She didn't try to reverse everything at once, and I didn't expect her to. She just showed up and worked, which was its own kind of language. 3 of Walt's veterans began volunteering on weekends. They were quiet men and women who worked hard and didn't need to be thanked out loud, which made me like them immediately. Derek filed the estate challenge. Marcus handled it in 4 weeks. The filing was dismissed without a hearing. Derek's attorney sent a formal withdrawal notice. I read it once and put it in the cedar chest with my father's letter. On the morning of the foundation's opening, I stood at the edge of the porch and looked at what had grown up around Eleanor's cabin. A modest addition to the east side held 4 transitional rooms, fully furnished. A converted barn behind the main structure housed the job training space and the veterans program room. A small playground had been built at the southern end of the clearing by volunteers from 3 counties. Walt came up beside me while I was standing there. He said, Eleanor walked this ground 100 times and never got to see this. I said, she got to see enough. She left the instructions. He tilted his coffee cup toward the tree line. She'd have argued with you about the roof pitch on that addition. I said, she'd have been right. We stood there a little longer while people arrived, filing up the gravel drive in 2s and 3s. local officials and program partners and volunteers, and women who had already called to ask when they could come. And mothers holding the hands of small children who looked at the playground and immediately pulled toward it. My mother found me near the door before the ceremony started. Clay. She put her hand through my arm the way she used to when I was in trim was trying to say something she didn't have quite the words for. She looked at the building, at the people, at the place that had grown from a sagging porch and a story about a woman who paid attention. She said, "I'm proud of you, Lily." Her voice was careful and honest. "I know that's late," I said. "It's not too late." She nodded and we went inside together. The ceremony was short because I had never liked long ceremonies. I said what needed to be said. That Eleanor Hargrove bought this land alone in 1951 because she believed in what it held, that my father protected it for decades because he believed in what it could become, that the women and veterans who would walk through these doors would find what Eleanor always insisted was here. Ground worth standing on. Afterward, when the official part was over and people had spread out into the rooms and the clearing, I walked down to the creek at the southern boundary of the property alone. The water was low and clear and moved steadily over the flat stones, the way it had been moving since before anyone owned this land and would keep moving after. Derek hadn't come. I hadn't expected him to. I thought about what he'd said at the funeral table, that the farmstead fit me perfectly, that it was a place for someone like me. He meant a woman without ambition, without resources, without the sense to know what she was looking at. He meant it as a closing argument. But standing at the creek with the sound of children's voices carrying from the playground across the water, I thought, yes, Derek, you were right about that. This place does fit me. It fits the part of me that pays attention. The part that stayed by my father's hospital bed. The part that learned from women in waiting rooms what it costs to have nowhere to go. The part that drove 3 hours on no sleep to look at a piece of land everyone else had already written off. Eleanor fit it the same way. She didn't wait for permission. She just looked at the ground and knew. I picked up a flat stone from the creek bed and turned it over in my palm. Smooth on one side, rough on the other. I set it back where I found it. When I walked back up through the clearing, Walt was on the porch with 2 cups of coffee, which by now I understood was his way of marking things that mattered. He handed me one without comment. We stood there while the afternoon light moved across the ridge and the trees and the place that had been called worthless until it wasn't anymore. Someone had carved Eleanor Hargrove's name into the stone lintel above the front door. Plain and clean. I looked at it for a long moment. Then, I went inside.